Have you ever wondered how many truths are kept hidden from you? How often someone manipulates your perception to keep you in the dark? Ethan was thrust into a reality where he had to uncover a secret no one wanted him to find. But what about you? If a secret could redefine your life, would you dare pursue the truth, no matter the cost? Or would you settle for a comforting lie? Ethan's path demanded courage, but the real question is, what would you do in his shoes? Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it, but what separates those who triumph from those who crumble is how they respond to these revelations. If you enjoy stories where the truth surfaces in a brutal yet necessary fashion, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because here, lies always come undone. The grandfather clock in the Carter mansion chimed close to midnight when Ethan was summoned to the study. His stepmother, Vivian's voice carried an icy formality, one he'd grown accustomed to since his father brought her home. He sat in the leather armchair, watching her meticulously manicured nails tap against the mahogany desk. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Her question was loaded with implication. He didn't. Or perhaps he did, but refused to acknowledge it. She slid a file across the table, pushing it as if discarding damning evidence. "This is a problem," she stated, as if the weight of those pages was enough to crush him. Ethan opened the file, his stomach twisting. It contained copies of bank transactions, documents implying a multi-million-dollar embezzlement from the Carter Empire. And all fingers pointed to him. His signature. His name. Yet he'd never seen these documents before. The silence that followed was stifling. Vivian offered a tight, cutting smile he knew all too well. "Your father trusted you, but frankly, Ethan, there's no other explanation." He felt his jaw clench. She wanted him to deny, to crumble, but he refused to give her the satisfaction. "This is a setup," he said, struggling to maintain composure. Something in his eyes amused her. She leaned in, whispering, perhaps. But evidence is evidence. Distress burned in his chest like acid. Vivian had never liked him. Since his mother's death years ago, their relationship had been cold and distant. Now she held a serious accusation in her hands and seemed determined to watch him fall. Ethan rose, taking a deep breath. "If this is a frame, you won't get away with it." Vivian simply chuckled, a soft, venomous sound. "Oh, darling. I already have." Ethan exited the study as if walking on shards of glass. He couldn't ignore what had just transpired. His father was hospitalized, unconscious, and the only person who might have protected him was gone. Or was she? The thought came like a distant echo. His mother. Would she have foreseen this? He rushed upstairs, unsure what he sought but sensing a shift was imminent. His mother's room remained nearly untouched. Her perfume still hung in the air, mingled with dust and time. He ran his fingers over the vanity where an old family photo rested in a silver frame. His fingertips brushed the bottom drawer, noticing it was slightly stuck, as if concealing something. With effort, he pulled the drawer open, and a small, yellowed envelope slid out, landing on the floor. His name was scrawled on the front, in his mother's delicate script. Ethan's heart pounded. With trembling hands, he opened the letter. The words within made the floor beneath him vanish. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means time has run out. There's something you need to know." And then everything changed. Ethan reread the opening lines, a mix of dread and disbelief washing over him. His mother's handwriting was unmistakable, each word imbued with urgency. "You must trust me. I know Vivian will try to turn everyone against you. But there's something I hid before I left. Something that can prove the truth." His hands tightened on the paper. How could she have known? How could she have predicted he'd be in this exact situation? The letter continued, revealing events he'd never heard of. "Before his death, your grandfather tried to stop a fraud being planned within the company. But he died before he could expose it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His grandfather, Robert Carter, had died of a sudden heart attack, or so they all believed. Now his mother implied something far darker. The final part of the letter made him gasp. "I hid the documents your grandfather gave me. They are proof that Vivian and others in the company were involved in corruption and embezzlement. I knew if I tried to expose them, they'd silence me." Ethan ran a hand over his face, reeling. This wasn't just a warning, it was a plea for justice. He scanned the room, trying to connect the pieces. Where could she have hidden these documents? The letter hinted vaguely, almost like a riddle. Seek where secrets were whispered and promises could never be kept. Ethan's chest tightened. His mother loved metaphors. It could mean anything. But then he remembered. The conservatory. As a child, his mother would take him there nightly, where they talked about everything and nothing at all. She always said it was the one place no one would interrupt them. And there was an old wooden bench where they would sit to talk about life. Could it be there? He had no time to lose. He hurried from the room, rushing through the mansion's silent corridor, each heartbeat a countdown. If Vivian was already framing him, it was only a matter of time before she took her next step. He needed to find the evidence before it was too late. Arriving in the conservatory, he knelt before the wooden bench. Memories flooded back, his mother holding his hands, saying one day he would understand everything. He slid his hands beneath the bench, feeling for anything unusual. His fingers brushed against something hard, a hidden compartment. Adrenaline surged through him. With a firm tug, he pulled out a small metal safe. It was locked. He checked his pockets, recalling the letter. There was a final line he'd almost missed. The answer has always been in our song. Song? Ethan strained to think. Then in a flash, he knew. He raced back to the room, heading straight for the music box his mother had given him as a child. It was old but still worked. He opened it, the gentle melody filling the air. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was the key to the safe. She had always known he would need it. And then everything clicked into place. Ethan clutched the key, feeling sweat bead on his neck. His heart hammered, knowing that opening the safe would forever alter his life. He returned to the conservatory, his hands trembling as he inserted the key into the rusty lock. A soft click echoed through the night. He inhaled deeply before lifting the lid. Inside was a stack of aged documents and a silver USB drive. His grandfather's name, Robert Carter, was printed on several sheets. He began reading, his eyes frantically scanning the lines. They were records of fraudulent transactions, manipulated contracts, solid proof that millions had been siphoned from the family company. But then he found something worse. A detailed dossier mentioned Vivian. But she wasn't alone. Several names from the company's top echelon were listed, including lawyers and even influential politicians. But what froze Ethan in place was the final name, his father. He blinked, unable to comprehend. Was his father involved? Or had he been deceived as well? The USB drive seemed to be the final piece of the puzzle. He raced back to his room and plugged it into his laptop. A folder containing videos appeared on the screen. With hesitant fingers, he clicked on the first file. The recording was old, grainy, but the voice was unmistakable. It was his mother. She sat in an office holding a stack of papers. If anything happens to me, Ethan needs to see this. He needs to know the truth. Her voice wavered, her eyes red with exhaustion. Robert discovered the embezzlement, and now they're trying to silence him. They're manipulating contracts, diverting money to international accounts. If I don't act now, no one will. The camera shook as she looked directly into it. Vivian and the others will do anything to keep this a secret. If you're seeing this, son, the worst has happened. But you can still stop them. Ethan closed his eyes, struggling to process it all. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a confession from someone who knew her life was at risk. He now possessed enough evidence to bring everyone down. But he also knew that he was now Vivian and her co-conspirators' #1 target. A noise in the hallway made him jump. He turned off the screen, clutching the USB drive. Someone was moving through the house. He knew that if Vivian discovered he had this evidence, she wouldn't hesitate. He needed to be smarter, faster, but above all, he needed to survive. And then a plan began to take shape. Fear gnawed at Ethan, but he knew he couldn't let it cripple him. Vivian was somewhere in the house, perhaps already suspecting he'd found something. He couldn't afford mistakes. The evidence was solid, but if she got to it before he could expose it, all would be lost. He had to be meticulous, calculating like a chess player sensing checkmate, needing that one precise move. First, ensure the evidence was secure. He pocketed the USB drive and the most damning documents inside his jacket. But that wasn't enough. He had to make copies. Quickly, he took photos of every vital page on his phone, then sent everything to a secure, encrypted email, using a secure storage service. If something happened to him, at least the truth wouldn't die with him. But that was still not enough. He needed allies. His contact list. Daniel Hawthorne. Ethan had met the investigative journalist years ago. Known for exposing corporate conspiracies, Ethan knew if anyone could break the story, it was him. He dialed, and after a few rings, a gravelly voice answered. Hawthorne. Ethan cut to the chase. I have a massive corporate fraud case. It involves my family, and I have proof. Silence. Then, meet me in half an hour. Ethan left the room, heading downstairs, trying to appear nonchalant. But his body was wired, every shadow a potential threat. Vivian wasn't stupid. If she suspected he was trying to leave with something, she'd stop him. As if the universe wanted to test his patience, she appeared at the foot of the stairs. Her gaze was sharp, assessing. "Where are you going at this hour, Ethan?" He forced a casual smile. "Just need some air. Couldn't sleep." She tilted her head, feline-like, watching her prey. "Strange. I thought you were occupied." Each word carried veiled intent, a silent threat. Ethan knew she suspected something. "Just clearing my head," he said, reaching the bottom step. Then his blood ran cold. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message. "Someone followed me. Think your family knows more than they're letting on." Vivian saw his reaction. A nearly imperceptible smile played on her lips. "You know, darling, it'd be a shame if you did something rash and put yourself in harm's way." Ethan swallowed hard. The chess game had just turned deadly, and he couldn't lose. The air grew thick. Any misstep could be his last. Vivian's gaze bored into him, each word a test. He smiled, feigning a calmness he didn't feel. "Just getting some air. Didn't realize I needed permission." The taunt was deliberate. He needed to divert her, create a distraction. But he couldn't underestimate her. She chuckled softly. "Of course, darling. Just be careful. One never knows what might happen in the dark." A shiver went down his spine. It was a warning, a clear message that she knew. And if she knew, she wasn't working alone. He walked to the door, feeling her eyes burning his back. As he reached for the handle, a sense of foreboding washed over him. If she knew he had the evidence, would she really let him leave that easily? He hesitated, and that fraction of a second was all it took. A firm hand gripped his arm. Before he could react, a security guard materialized to his right. Large, strong, with a face that asked no questions. "Mrs. Vivian would like you to stay inside tonight." His voice was devoid of emotion. Ethan tried to pull away, but the guard's grip was immense. Vivian smiled, pleased. "Ethan, darling, I know you're going through a lot. Your father in the hospital, these accusations. Perhaps it's best you rest." The subtext was clear. She intended to trap him inside his own home. But he couldn't afford to waste time. Meeting Daniel was his only chance. He glanced around, his mind racing. If he fought the guard, he'd lose. If he returned inside, he'd be a prisoner. He needed to be swift, unpredictable. In a sudden move, he threw his weight backward, catching the guard off balance for just a moment. A moment was all he needed. He spun on his heel and bolted for the side door. He didn't know if he could escape, but he wouldn't wait to find out. The cold night air hit him hard as he ran into the garden. Behind him, he heard Vivian shout orders to the other guards, no doubt, but he was already moving. He scaled the side fence, landing awkwardly on the sidewalk. His car was a few meters away. If he could reach it, he'd still have a chance. As he neared his vehicle, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The tires were slashed. They knew. They were waiting. Then, a headlight pierced the dark street. A black car with tinted windows. Ethan knew instantly. He wasn't safe. And the game had just changed. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he ran down the dark street. The black car began to move slowly, a predator stalking its prey. He knew if he stood his ground, he wouldn't stand a chance. His car was useless, the house was a trap, and Vivian had tightened the noose. He darted into a nearby alley, weaving through smaller streets. He had to lose them before he could meet Daniel. The journalist knew something was wrong and would be waiting at a safe location. But how to get there without being followed? His chest burned, his muscles screamed, but he couldn't stop. After a frantic few minutes, he spotted a taxi stopped at a light. Without hesitation, he yanked open the passenger door and jumped inside. The driver, a skeptical-looking middle-aged man, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You all right, man?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to mask his panic. "Just drive. Fast." The taxi sped off. Ethan watched the rearview. The black car rounded the corner seconds later. They were on him. He grabbed his phone and sent a quick text to Daniel. "Need a plan B. I'm being followed." The journalist replied almost instantly. "Grandwood Hotel, 7th floor." Stairs only. At the hotel, Ethan paid the driver and jumped out before the black car turned the corner. He bolted into the building, ignoring the curious stares of the front desk. He took the stairs, climbing 7 floors 2 steps at a time, his lungs burning. He couldn't rest. In the 7th floor hallway, Daniel Hawthorne waited. The journalist, a man with tousled hair and piercing eyes, held a tablet and a cold coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, raising an eyebrow. Ethan had no time for niceties. "Vivian knows. They're hunting me." Daniel closed the door and tossed the tablet on the table. "Then we better move quickly." He tapped the screen and a video began to play. "Before meeting you, I did some digging. What I found isn't pretty." Ethan stepped closer to the screen and his stomach dropped. It was footage from a hospital. His father's room. But that wasn't what shocked him. It was Vivian standing next to a doctor, and what she was doing left no doubt. She was bribing him. And then everything clicked into place. Ethan's throat tightened as he watched the screen. Vivian stood in the hospital, talking to a tense-looking doctor. The video had no audio, but her body language said it all. She was giving orders. The doctor alternated between discomfort and reluctance, before finally accepting an envelope she discreetly pushed into his hand. Daniel paused the video, crossing his arms. "This doctor works in intensive care. Your father should be treated by another team." But he was transferred to this guy's care 3 weeks ago with no official explanation. Ethan leaned forward, feeling the weight of the revelation. "Are you saying that perhaps your father's illness isn't accidental?" Daniel finished, his voice grave. Ethan's heart pounded. His father's accident had always seemed suspicious, but he had no proof. Now, it seemed Vivian might have been manipulating the situation, possibly hastening his demise. Ethan ran a hand over his face, trying to collect his thoughts. If his father was still alive, maybe he knew something, some clue about the documents, Vivian's involvement, everything. If Vivian was willing to manipulate him, even in the hospital, time was running out. He had to reach his father. "I have to go there," he said, already moving. Daniel grabbed his arm. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? They probably have people watching that hospital. If you show up, it could be the end." Ethan wrenched his arm free. "If I don't go, it could be the end for my father." Daniel hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but we do this right." He pulled out his phone and dialed. "I know someone on the inside. If we want you in undetected, we'll need help." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the frozen image on the tablet. He had the evidence of corruption, the financial schemes, the lies, but now he was facing something more sinister. His father's life might be in Vivian's hands, and he couldn't let that happen. The hospital glowed under the cold streetlights as Ethan and Daniel parked a few blocks away. The plan was simple: slip in unnoticed and check on his father. But Ethan knew nothing would be simple. If Vivian had influence inside, it was only a matter of time before she spotted him. The nurse Daniel mentioned waited at the back entrance. Rachel Montgomery, a quick-talking woman with watchful eyes, led them through the quiet corridors. "Your father shouldn't be in this ward," she whispered. "The transfer came directly from administration. Something's wrong. He's been heavily sedated for days." Ethan's chest tightened. "Sedated?" She nodded. "High doses. And I can't find any legitimate medical reason. He should be awake." Ethan exchanged a look with Daniel. Things were worse than they thought. Vivian wasn't just removing him from the picture. She was keeping him in a coma. Rachel led them to room 307. "I can give you 5 minutes. Then someone will notice." Ethan nodded, his heart racing. He turned the knob and slipped inside. His father looked a shadow of his former self. His gray hair was disheveled, his skin pale, his breathing too shallow. Anger simmered in Ethan's stomach. He went to the bed and took his father's hand. "Dad, it's me." "Nothing." But Ethan refused to believe he was completely unresponsive. He looked around. He needed proof of what was happening. He grabbed his phone and began snapping photos of the medical charts beside the bed. The name of the doctor Vivian had bribed was there. Everything connected. Then, something unexpected happened. His father's hand moved, a weak but definite squeeze. Ethan froze. "Dad." For an instant, his eyes fluttered open, trying to focus on him. A voice, hoarse and faint, whispered, "Ethan, don't trust." The monitors began to beep. Rachel rushed in. "You have to go. Now." But Ethan didn't want to leave. Now he knew his father was still there, trapped in a forced torpor. His last words echoed, "Don't trust who?" The door flew open. Ethan knew time was up. The door crashed open. Two security guards in dark suits entered, followed by Vivian, as impeccable as ever. The hospital was her territory, and she knew it. Ethan felt his chest tighten when he saw her knowing smirk. I expected more," she said, shaking her head as if he were a rebellious teenager caught in the act. Daniel stepped next to him, eyes hard. "You drug a defenseless man to protect your secrets?" Vivian laughed softly. "My dear, if I've learned anything in business, it's that some secrets are worth more than truth." Ethan's fists clenched. "Not this time. You can't bury the truth. I have everything. The embezzlement, the fraud, the doctor's bribe." He raised his phone. "What happens when this goes to the police? Or the press?" Vivian's smile faltered. For the first time, she looked worried. Then, as if remembering something, she tilted her head. "Ethan, darling, you think this scares me? You're just a boy playing a game way above your head." She gestured, and a guard pulled a gun. Daniel stepped forward, but Ethan raised his hand. He looked at Vivian and smiled. "Then shoot me." Her smile flickered. He kept going. "If you pull that trigger, it ends here." He turned his phone, showing the countdown timer. "I just sent everything to a trusted contact. In 5 minutes, this whole story hits the front page. If I don't cancel the transmission, you won't like what happens." The silence was stifling. The guard held the gun, waiting. Vivian pressed her lips, hatred burning in her eyes. She knew Ethan wasn't bluffing. His phone buzzed. A message. "Got it. It's done." Vivian took a breath, fighting for control. "You think you've won." She moved closer, voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. If I go down, I'm not going down alone." Ethan met her gaze without blinking. "Then enjoy the fall." Sirens wailed outside. The police had arrived. The sirens echoed through the hallway, causing Vivian's face to lose color for a split second. She knew the game was over. She still tried to hold her composure, her icy eyes scanning the room. The guard hesitated, waiting for orders. She didn't give any. Police rushed in, weapons drawn. "Everyone down. Drop your weapons." The guard lowered his gun, and Vivian raised her hands with a theatrical sigh. "This is absurd. I'm a businesswoman. None of this makes sense." The detective didn't flinch. "You can explain at the station." Ethan stood watching as she was cuffed. He didn't feel relief, not yet. He knew this battle was won, but the war for his family's legacy was far from over. As she passed, Vivian whispered, "This isn't over." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Her fate was sealed. As the officers led her away, Ethan turned toward the hospital room. His father was still unconscious, but now there was hope. Rachel approached, her eyes kind. "Now that she's gone, we can reduce the sedation. He could wake up in days." Ethan exhaled, a breath he felt he'd been holding for years. Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "You know this will be a scandal. Companies like this don't fall quietly." Ethan looked at his friend and smiled faintly. "Good. That noise is exactly what I want." In the days that followed, the story dominated headlines. Corporate fraud, manipulation, corruption. Vivian and her accomplices faced charges that could imprison them for decades. For Ethan, the real victory came when he walked into the hospital and saw his father awake. His tired eyes focused on his son, and his voice was weak but clear. "You did the right thing." Ethan held his hand, feeling the weight of all that had transpired. The Carter Empire had survived, now belonging to someone who deserved to carry it. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan knew his mother would have been proud.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.